Okay, so we're going to go straight in. As you see, we have a broad representation across different industries here, which I'm so excited because I've been looking forward to this for a while. I know Tyler has as well, and very keen to get the different insights, but it is very much an interactive event. So we do welcome participation from the audience members. Okay, so the first question we have is, and this is very much open to the panel, anyone can take this one. How do you characterize the open data economy? What does it actually mean to your industry, or more broadly speaking, what do you think it means to the world in general, the open data economy? Anyone can take that.
Sure. Yeah. Currently, data is really siloed and centralized in a lot of these big organizations, really centralized in the big four: Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Twitter, and these different social media platforms that compile all of this data. The problem with that is, they really have control of the future of artificial intelligence and machine learning in terms of how things and how the economy and the industry is going to progress. I think that leaves out a lot for other private sectors and smaller businesses to develop innovations, right? So for the open data economy to flourish, there needs to be access for data to build out these machine learning models for different industries. Like Salima has mentioned, for healthcare, it's a massive problem with regulation in terms of sharing data, and she'll get into that. But to have an open data economy where we can share and we can really focus on maybe clinical trials for smart cities. And with the development of 5G and things like that, there's going to be a lot more data that's going to be available in our ecosystem. So allowing that data to be shared and integrated in different platforms that the economy can flourish, and we can have more innovation and developments in this space.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think maybe just to build on that point, it's funny because this highlights the challenge. I think you mentioned two key words which kind of resonate with me. So you talked about the sheer amount of data and the fact that it's consolidated with just a few set companies. I think less than 10 companies own something like over 80% of the data right now. But you also mentioned machine learning, and that brings to mind the fact that machine learning, by its very nature, means that a lot of the data is going to continue to be consolidated, right? So as these models learn more and more, and when I talk about data, I'm talking about high quality data. It becomes increasingly consolidated, right? Because the better models will continuously start to drive innovation, and then they get much more data they can capture. I'd be very keen to see what that means to areas like healthcare, because that poses a significant challenge. But also, I think, Baran and Tara, obviously with smart cities and smart cars, those are huge industries in themselves, and there's lots of innovation happening there. What that means, it'll be very interesting to see how that potentially could impact those industries as this data I guess, becomes ubiquitous, but the quality data may not necessarily be available to the ones that need it. And the same applies to the work you're doing, Victor and Anthony, in both in areas like sustainability. I know there's a lot of exciting projects at Block Apps, and Anthony with justice, which again is a very cutting edge space as well. So any other perspectives given those challenges that we need to address?
Yeah, so I find that in every industry that you can look at, there's sort of a big intermediary that plays a part in kind of aggregating data. This can be consumer companies like we've talked about, like Facebook, Google, but it also exists in industries like the airline industry has like GDSs, global distribution systems, that aggregate the data, and you see them in front of websites like Expedia. And when I think about the open data economy, really, I think about the economy part. Like, how do you more incentivize the data providers directly to provide better transparency through their products and their information? And they have to have an incentive of why to do that. And those incentives are really kind of being established now. One incentive that we're seeing is really around work that we're doing in making better product labeling and product certification. So for example, in the sustainability space, people are talking a lot about greenwashing because they don't know where carbon credits are coming from. And having that transparency, having that information provides an additional value to the consumer, but it also provides an incentive for the companies to share that information. So I think we really, don't want to be too controversial, but I personally prefer the word collaborative data economy, just because open, I think in some cases like open source tends to mean free. But like I said, we have to think of really good incentive models to help drive the adoption of these more decentralized data solutions.
Fully agree. Thank you. Yeah. Angie, did you want to make a point?
I think that there also is a number of privacy issues in regards to having data on the open economy that need to be taken into consideration in regards to protecting people's individual data assets and things like that. So that obviously is something that is very important in regards to what data you're sharing about individuals and protecting, people and assets from threats to their individual well-being, and that's essentially what we do. But that's something else that obviously needs to be taken into consideration in regards to the predictive justice element. So yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
I think the issue of like data privacy and confidentiality and security and safety is definitely one of the biggest barrier to like the open, well, it's one of the biggest barrier of like collecting data that can be used like for cities, because obviously there are a lot of like public hesitancy and citizen concerns, and we see it a lot in a lot of like district projects or pilot projects where cities are trying to collect data. There will be some uproar from like citizens because they still don't know what the data is used for. But as we develop more the open data economy and we empower citizens to actually become producers of that data as well, and we were able to like roll out the incentives for them to like really get ownership of that data, that will like boost the open innovation, the open data economy in cities and in smart cities.
Yes, indeed. Very good point. Thank you.
So I was going to say, from the healthcare perspective, I think it's really, the open data economy is really about access and sharing and building trust in a system. So the privacy and security issues surrounding, patient records is of utmost importance. But I think one of the things that what it really means to think about open data is to think about all of the fragmented industries that are connected in the healthcare system. So when you think about the information that is sitting, with the primary healthcare doctors or with the hospitals, is it getting to where it needs to get to, which is the research institutions, the life sciences, the pharma companies that are building the treatments and diagnostic protocols of the future. So one of the issues, I think, is that because of all the data privacy and compliance and regulations that are there, solutions need to sort of be developed to be able to share, data securely or de-identified, so we're not sharing private information of patients. But that's really where the crux of the problem lies, is the sharing and the access, so that we can get to the researchers faster and they can do their studies so that we can actually advance medicine.
So essentially what our organization will do is essentially we've got the technology to put algorithms on top of that, so quantum of proof algorithms, that if there has been a data breach, we can analyze that and we can see and automate the process so that there is that algorithm in place. So if there has been a data breach as an element of justice, so that could apply to the medical sector as well in regards to patients' confidentiality and integrity of their individual personal information and things like that. So it's about automating the process, if that makes sense, in terms of predictive justice, so that how it integrates into data privacy and that sort of thing. So that's essentially what we do with our platform.
And that's the great thing about these kinds of forums. It drives it emphasizes the possibilities, right? You start to see potential solutions and ideas. You know, I mean, I really didn't know until quite recently, from speaking to Anthony, that there is now the possibility you can actually build a layer. Quantum libraries exist, and they're actually being used to build real world solutions. You know, so you layer that on top of blockchain, it opens up a world of possibilities in terms of you know, driving that innovation, especially when it comes to data privacy. So thanks for making that point, Anthony. Yeah, great. So were there any final points on that initial question?
I just want to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, yeah, I like the points that everybody made and that Baran made as well. Like, I think that one thing to think about sometimes is that, you know, data kind of to be useful and to be understood and transparent and open for those that also are giving it to us, so to speak, needs to kind of be in like the vernacular of the time, right? If you think about it, in the very olden days, data was like human stories that people told around a fireplace. It was very understandable. You could pass it down from generation to generation, and there was real transparency about it. And I think today, for a lot of people, whether it's from the Facebooks or the Googles or the whoever's of the world, or whether it's smart cities, there's a sort of feeling, if it's controversial to say so, that there's a bit of data daddying going on in parenting, where it's like you've got conglomerates or cities kind of deciding what they do with data behind closed doors, and it's not always really clear to the citizen what the benefit is to them in the real life, or their impact will be in X amount of time. And I think that, you know, having that kind of engagement is important for like long-term success of data programs at scale overall.
Very good point. We can't have true data ownership if there's no real transparency, right? It just doesn't go hand in hand. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm just going to make one more point. I think one of the other, you know, great opportunities when we bring forums like this together is to say that not only solutions coming from other industries, but the real goal here of an open data economy is to now start making the connections and integrating different data points and data sets from different industries for better insights, so that we're not even looking at health or well-being in a sort of siloed manner or in a narrow manner. We're really connecting it to smart cities. We're really connecting it to financial well-being. We're really connecting it to the insurance industries. And so I think it's really about how that data is going to be organized and structured and aggregated that's going to be adding the value of the future. And so all of this, there needs to be an openness even amongst various industries as well.
Thank you very much.
I also want to add, like, you know, we've been talking about data privacy, but I actually think what we kind of need is really data management and control and verifiability. So you need both elements, right? You need the ability to share information collaboratively with the parties that you want to share it with, whether it's completely open or whether it's a small subgroup. But you also need to verify, okay, when was that information provided, and is the information I'm seeing the same as the information that was provided originally? At BlockApps, actually, that's one of our major features. We call it private chains, and we've implemented that, you know, in these sort of production scale solutions in different industries. And it's really important, I think, coming back to the economy point, is that because if the data is just, you know, like a standard blockchain model open to everyone, then it's very hard to build any kind of competitive advantage for an individual or company. So you need both those aspects. You need the ability to say, you know, I'm sharing data when I want to, and you can verify it whenever you like to make sure that the data is correct, but also that there's a way to kind of do that in an automated fashion with tools.
Yeah, and I'd love to perhaps later on just dig into that a little bit more, Victor, because I think if my understanding correct, for that kind of thing to work, you know, you're talking about cross-industry collaboration, right? We need to have interoperability across blockchains to get true collaboration, but also to get you know, processes that work in the way that supply chains work today, and how you replicate that in a decentralized world. Be very interesting to find out what your vision is at BlockApps as well, you know. So thanks for that point. Okay, if there's any questions, just a quick point from the audience, please feel free. Either you raise your virtual hand or you just post it here, and we'll be sure to make sure it comes to the attention of the panel. So that's actually a nice segue into the next question we have here. And some of you already kind of highlighted this. So the question here is, what key data-related challenges do you encounter in your specific industry? Are there any aspects that haven't been touched on? I know there's been talk of privacy, and I think security came up. There could be some other items that you'd like to highlight that you might have encountered in your industry. So again, to the panel, any additional challenges that we haven't highlighted?
I think monetization is a huge point that we need to touch on, because what's the value and ultimately the demand for this data in the economy, right? So using the blockchain and using tokenization, which is specifically what we're focused on at Talbase, is to tokenize not only the access control for that data, so you can see the transparency of how that data is moving on the blockchain, but as well as creating liquidity pools surrounding that data and having that collaborative effort for users in the community to stake against that data, to consume that data token, and ultimately that determines the value of data. Think about buying and selling cryptocurrencies currently in decentralized exchanges. We could have decentralized exchanges for the access for data. So ultimately, as more of that data is bought in the form of a token, that would fluctuate the price of that data in an open market. Because primarily, what is the cost of your data? That's really being determined in close quarters, in closed rooms, saying, we have this data, it's in our database, but really, what's it worth to anybody, and how do we monetize off of this, right? I think, having an open market would really facilitate the demand and the value of that data through the buying and selling, and also facilitating supply and demand on how much access you mint to that data. So let's say you have a data set and you only want 100 enterprises or entities to have access to that data. The market would really decide, determining through buying and selling to the access to that data, right? So monetization is a huge point that we need to look at with the open data economy.
That's such a vital point, yeah, because I think in terms of sharing the data is one thing, but you wouldn't want to share it if you don't understand the value, right? And increasingly, we're going to find that organizations want to understand the value so they can, understand the cost dynamics. I was thinking of one potential scenario in a discussion with someone quite recently. If we're trying to envision, say, for example, we know Tesla, I think they've opened up their code libraries to other car manufacturers, right? So the idea is to drive sustainability. I'm sure Tara and Bonnet, it might be areas that you guys are aware of, which means that other car manufacturers can leverage their technology, which is good for the environment. Everyone wants to shift towards electric cars. Are these manufacturers going to be sharing data as well? So, electric cars and autonomous vehicles on the road, are they going to be able to share data, which could have benefits for safety? But then how do you monetize it? That's just one kind of scenario you tend to think about it. How do you actually put a cost on that data as it's been shared across different IoT devices or cars or airplanes? So it'll be amazing to see how that marketplace develops. And then you start to think about healthcare, your domain, Selima. And then I think the challenge there is even more it's a huge challenge, right? Because now you're talking about clinical data and patient information, which is subject to rigorous compliance and so on and so forth. But then when you go across different jurisdictions where you want to share clinical trial data, how does that work? How do you monetize that? It'd be fascinating to get any insights any of you have on those points.
I can give some real world examples if you like from ag and sustainability. So, for example, a lot of the work we do in the agriculture world is really around traceability. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you go to the store and you buy a slice of meat, if it says organic on it, it's worth more than something that doesn't have that label on it. Now, we're helping consumer companies be able to dynamically kind of create that labels in a trusted way. So what does that mean? That means that they can put sustainably sourced, and consumers, or at least the end companies, can know, here are the requirements that were fulfilled, that I can put that label on my product. The benefit of that for the consumer company is they can charge more for that product. So there's an incentive for them to do it. And at Block Apps, what we do is we take some of that additional profit and we distribute it back to the growers who are providing that data. So we have that sort of incentive kind of flowing back between the parties that are making more money and the parties that should be receiving more money for providing that data. That's just one kind of example in the ag industry. But we're seeing very similar things in the sustainability world more generally. People want to be able to say this product is carbon neutral, but customers are saying, wait a second, what does that mean? Like, yeah, like you may have heard like Microsoft or other companies are starting to buy carbon offsets directly from agricultural companies because there's a problem with greenwashing. Like, there's been plenty of examples of like companies that have sold more carbon credits based on tree planting than there are square feet in the country they're planting on, right? So, the traceability and the reliability of where that information comes from provides an additional value, and that value needs to be passed back to the people who are providing that data. And that's, how we kind of think about that economy in terms of block apps.
Victor, can I delve a little deeper? And by the way, there's a question from one of the attendees I'm going to pass on to the panel in a second. But just on that point, Victor, I'll be very keen to see if you can share any insights, either at block apps or maybe at the Ethereum Alliance. There may be some discussion points at the board level there, particularly around the area of monetization, but specifically when it comes to the forthcoming regulation. We know that there's going to be regulation, especially within financial markets and cryptocurrencies and so on and so forth. More broadly, that's going to have an impact on the whole decentralization market that we have today. Do you see regulation impacting when it comes to things like data or valuation of data, or do you think that the governments around the world are likely to leave it to the private sector? You guys determine the value of data, you come up with the right policies and strategies. Do you think it's going to be left to its own devices, let the capital markets determine the value? Or do you think that they're going to want to put some kind of controls in place, especially when you think about smart city design, healthcare, airline travel, those kind of vital industries that could be impacted?
Yeah, so I'm not a government official, so I can't speak on governments, but I can tell you what I see from the industry standpoint. Industries are realizing that there is value to be had by being more transparent. Like all the ESG, what's happening on ESG, what's happening on board governances, all of these things are kind of forcing companies to be more transparent about their practices, and in turn, providing better data around those practices, right? So that is happening on a market level. I was speaking at COP26 like a couple of weeks ago about, sustainability and data transfers, and there's going to be a push-pull from governments. So governments are clearly putting in requirements that companies need to respond to, and in responding to those things, in setting those requirements up, the companies are responding. But, generally companies move faster than the governments, right? They're trying to figure these solutions because everyone knows it's coming. And technology moves even faster than most of these companies. So we need to make sure that the technology to manage this data in the way with these privacy controls, which governance around these networks is transparent and open. So we can build models that governments will be comfortable with and want to adopt. So it's a moving picture where everything is kind of moving together. I will say we mostly focus on non-crypto usage versions of blockchain, right? Like we focus on the technology adoption, and that leaves us away from more of the complex regulatory environment of crypto itself as an asset. So that is something that's really kind of emerging among different governments, and they're trying to get different handles on it. So that's an emerging area. But you can see, for example, that things where you're doing sort of something closer to rights management versus an asset, say an NFT, for example. Like no government has come up anti-NFT because buying rights for artistic works or other things is already a business. That's something that businesses already do. Buying bags of seeds or agricultural products or carbon credits, it's already something companies are doing. We're just trying to make that more transparent and more frictionless between the parties that are engaged in it.
Thank you, Victor. Appreciate that perspective. Okay. Right, we have a question here from Ash Basil. Thank you, Ash. So the question is, if you haven't seen it, an open or collaborative data sharing paradigm need not be managed or controlled by a centralized aggregator and should allow the actual owner of that data, in other words, the individual, to have real control over that sharing, not the vendor he or she is engaging with. Would love to get the panel's thoughts on this. Any thoughts?
For sure. They say, your data is worth, everyone's data is worth about $10,000 a year in just how much you provide to these social media platforms, right? So, I mean, I really think that there needs to be a mechanism to take back the value of that data, take the data and be able to monetize it individually, personalized data that's monetized. In Talibase, we're really focused on that in terms of if you were to, it's hard, right? It's a hard process to get the access to your data from Facebook or access, but it's a process, but it can be done, right? But at the end of the day, I mean, that's my my argument for universal basic income. I know that we're not focused on that right now, but if everybody's worth $10,000 a year in data, right, that really should be the basis of universal basic income, just what our data is worth that's being collected from us just using these platforms, right? So I'm not saying I solved UBC, but or UBI, but I definitely think that there needs to be ownership that's taken back for our personalized data. I completely agree.
I think Tyler just launched the universal coin. Great idea.
Mhm.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I think it's a big challenge because it's one thing, we imagine that, fortunately we have GDPR, which certainly helps, right? But we know that ownership of data is, if you didn't have ownership, then somebody's going to lose out. If you had full ownership, then somebody's not going to make ad revenues, So it's a very interesting play that's taking place right now. And I think it all kind of comes back to, I guess, Victor's earlier point about what kind of regulatory climate we're going to see as things evolve and decentralized models become more the norm rather than the exception. Fantastic. Okay, so we have another question here from John Burns. Thank you, John. John says, I wear two hats, change agent for a major government agency, and he's also a business consultant for an NGO setting up small towns in up to 140 countries to operate investment-friendly centers. So top down for the government, totally decentralized for the NGO. I'm very interested in Victor's block apps for the provenance of branding a product or service. Also the transparency and tracking of the ESG data. I guess that's a thumbs up there for you, Victor. I don't know if you've got any comments.
Sure.
John will be connecting. Yeah.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to more, and kind of to Tyler's point too, is that I think one of the things that you have to think about is that data in and of itself is, I would argue, somewhat worthless, because unstructured data doesn't really create value that you can kind of adopt easily to other marketplaces, right? So there needs to be some layer of governance, like when I talk about an organic certification or an ESG score, someone needs to make sure that the data is being provided in some kind of standardized format, so you can look at it and understand what it is, right? I think one of the things that we've seen broadly is that in terms of kind of managing data is that I mentioned before about the verifiability of data. Verifiability also includes, being able to not double spend data, to use a blockchain term, right? Like if you have a carbon credit, you want to make sure that that's a single credit and I'm not piggybacking off of something else. But there's also, in Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions, companies and services need to get information from their vendors or their suppliers on what they are doing on behalf of them. Now, that also, you don't want to be double spent. For example, at Block Apps, we use, we're multi-cloud, we use a bunch of different cloud providers, and they say, like, based on our energy usage, they're applying this carbon emissions to us. Well, we as a company want to know, how do we know where that number is coming from, right? That information is coming from. So I think the driver of all of this is that economic value. If you think about how do you create that value in the end thing from the data, like it could be a label, it could be a product, it could be a carbon credit that produces higher value. So I think it's clear that, food products that have those kind of traceability elements are worth more. I would argue that carbon credits with those kind of traceability elements would be worth more. And then you take that additional value and you disseminate it along the people who are providing that data. And if you can think about things in that way, then you can have a system that will adopt quickly. Whereas we've seen many people, they use blockchains or multi-party technologies like that, but they're like, wait, I still want to be greedy and grab all the benefits myself. And we're like, well, that's never going to work. Like you're just replacing what already exists with your own, with slightly different technology, right? You really got to think about how do you make sure all the participants are incentivized properly. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. Much appreciated. Yeah. Tara, did you want to kind of talk just briefly about how you see this playing out within, say, when it comes to car mobility, that industry, which I think is a very exciting space, we know. But then I think not many of us, certainly me, I don't really have a kind of good insight into, the likes of Uber and all these companies that are using data and how they're monetizing data, but also all the new players coming to the marketplace, right? I mean, I think there's literally hundreds now. What's actually happening in that industry? What can you kind of tell us that we perhaps may not be aware of?
Sure. I think that one of the things that, I'm sure that as well as that Saleema and like Brian probably similarly would have those points, I'm sure, but this idea that we brought up a fragmentation, I think, that Saleema brought up is, I think, really important. If you're looking at transportation, for example, the problem that you have is like, it's great that you have all these technology companies that their expertise is how do you set up data and dashboards and analytics, and that's what they know really well, and they know monetization really well. But if you look at a city and you look at transit and all the sort of mobility as a service that people are trying to do, where you get on-demand transportation and they're trying to work with public sector transit agencies, those guys have stuff where literally they're taking still ticket boxes and the hard drives out of those boxes and downloading that information, and that information does not talk to whatever Uber does. So it's like, you've got a lot of data legacy, and this is where there's a lot of fragmentation. There's not a lot of standardization. These companies are not really helping necessarily figure out a data standard for cities to look at, or, across themselves even. So I think that's sort of part of it, and that makes mobility as a service very difficult, including if you look at then payment fragmentation and lots of different players. And then when you look at it from the user point of view, their life isn't really easy. They just have to download like 50 different apps, and you didn't make their city that much easier to get around. So I think those are aspects to sort of look at. And I think the other aspect to look at is that in terms of monetization, well, I think those apps are doing well, not that they're not. I think the thing that's really different, though, is that if you look at the way governments and public sectors have to set up things, the reality is they're trying to benefit the masses, right? They're actually trying to provide a service, and a long-term service. So the fact of the matter is, if they stand up a line or they put something out into the universe, they're responsible for it. And if an Uber, or, I'm being transparent, any technology company put something out there, they shut it down if it doesn't make any money. But if you decide that you're going to run a route with somebody in a city, and then you decide that you're going to shut it down, the reality is all those people still need to get to work the next day and feed their families. So we have a very different attitude in technology sometimes, and forget these everyday realities. And I think that that's where, the private and the public sector have to talk together better if we really actually want to stand up some of these things across our universes.
Absolutely, yeah. And you don't want that. We don't want to have monopolies, right? We want to avoid that kind of evolving, which means, yeah, I guess it means we're going to need policies and regulation at some point to help drive that. And that's probably something, I guess, Baran, your types of organizers are going to help give governments and agencies the guidance on how to implement these policies and how to make sure that it's transparent and also it's equitable as well,
Yeah, definitely. I think on Tara's point, I think mobility is actually a really good example, because you have that multiplicity of like stakeholders, but also that impact on like 100,000 millions of people like moving across the city at any point, and they are the one providing the data. But one thing that was interesting actually in terms of data is well, what happened with COVID, and basically there was no way, apart from like the public transport authorities, no one knew the impact of COVID on mobility, and the people who knew that were the Ubers, the Google, the Apples, who actually collected the mobility data. And the moment that they like kind of like shared it and made it public, that's when people could actually, well, the local, the regional, national governments could actually start to make policies and really rethink as well, like the kind of like routes, or really actually take a step back and analyze the mobility in their city, because they never really had to think about it. And I guess another thing in terms of like monetization is also, as Tara was saying, is kind of like everybody stands something to gain from like the open data economy, because for an Uber or for on-demand transport operator, or even now with like the e-scooters and new mobility solutions, by analyzing the data that is available, that's how they get to see where the demand is or where there's a gap in supply, and that's how they can like create the routes that are like necessary well, to meet the demand and make it easier for the citizens. And I think that's the main like benefit and like goal for like cities. It's really for city managers, it's really to make their cities like better for like their citizens. And the moment they can get the data and interact with like other stakeholders, then everybody like stands to gain from it, either in terms of like private benefits or like better operations and public service delivery for city managers.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, and I think this is why monetization standards are probably going to have some kind of mechanism to be put in place. One quick point, I think, Vector, you mentioned earlier on, I think there is a big challenge when it comes to standard, or the absence of standards, right? But in some industries, we have seen, some attempts to build not just data standards. You think about ISO 20022 for payment messaging, and this is something that's happening globally for payments, but also EDM Council, where I'm part of that discussion point, and the idea is to implement some standards for sharing data ontologies. So there's a lot of exciting work taking place there, and you can layer on knowledge graphs to make the sharing of that data have a much more intuitive user interface. So tons of innovation happening there. But I'm glad we're kind of going into solutions, because I'm very keen to touch on two critical industries, which both from Anthony and from Salima, because I think justice and law and order and healthcare, without doubt, are areas that are of tremendous importance to all of us. So now building on that, perhaps Salima or Anthony, if you want to kind of talk about kind of solutions that you have put in place to address some of the challenges that we've already looked at. So we talked about data privacy, security, quality, monetization. What kind of solutions or kind of frameworks are being implemented in healthcare and justice? Maybe starting with Salima, any thoughts about how you're addressing those challenges?
Well, part of creating this high performance healthcare network is to say that when you look at the healthcare industry in the Canadian context, but in any context, you have all of these different players that are not necessarily aligned or incentivized to align on creating or breaking down those silos. So you have various different data points that are sitting everywhere. And even within the system, that collaboration can't necessarily come together because there's no incentive to do so. So part of creating this network was to say, can we bring together all of the different various pieces? The clinical research organization, the doctors, the specialists, the diagnostic imaging services. And that way we can create a foundation and a data ontology in which we can actually aggregate and structure and bring the right pieces of data together so that we can actually interrogate that data to ask very important questions. very similar to what the panel has been talking about, even on the quality side. How do we measure ourselves? How do we create evidence-based insights that can inform policy, that can change, because that, the data never lies. So to really get a real understanding of how many healthcare dollars we're spending, how much the government is doing, so I think it's really going to help us we're really trying to use that data on the quality side and to improve and to create efficiencies in systems that are misaligned and creating that sort of streamlined patient journey. So it's really about getting, patients through the system and using the data to help us understand how we're going to do that. But I think, I was thinking really about one of the aspects that is another solution that needs to kind of be worked on, I would welcome the panel's thoughts on, which is really thinking about data ownership in the healthcare context. Because, I think there's sometimes a misnomer that those that collect patient data own patient data. But we actually have a system by which, at least in the Canadian context, of custodianship, so that you're not owners of the data, but you're a custodian of that data. And so you have to get patient consent if you're going to use that data. But we also know that the data being collected through the healthcare sector and generated is the fastest growing and will exceed any other industry. So now we're talking about the value of that healthcare data, who owns it, and when we're talking about the monetization or the commercialization of that data, what are the models that are going to be created to include all of the different various actors and key stakeholders that are interacting with that data or adding value to that data? So I think that's an interesting topic that I think kind of covers all sectors, but it's especially relevant, I think, in the healthcare sector.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think you allude to a point which John made in his follow-up point, which is he actually talked about he likes Hannah's idea of tokenization and staking and liquidity pools. And this is something of great interest to us at Netra Digital. And John goes on to say, this is where the small towns I'm insisting can find external funding sources and sustainable sources of income. So it's a wonderful way of actually helping to create equity, on a global level. I mean, this is very exciting space. I'm not sure that there's a full understanding of the possibilities of blockchain technology as yet, but I think that's going to continue to change as people start to really kind of dig deeper. So just building on that, Anthony, what kind of solutions are you seeing in the law and order space? So you talk about the solutions that you're working on, very exciting.
Yes,
if you could delve deeper.
Yeah, I think there's different issues in regards to different jurisdictional issues in regards to the different areas of the world in which law and order is made. So it's about aggregating those laws into an algorithm to be able to then gather that data onto a blockchain system to obviously automate the solution and to ensure that there is an aggregation. And the problem is the different compliance issues and the different regulatory issues around the world in terms of building those artificial intelligence modules and combining it with the jurisdictional issues, and what sort of artificial intelligence models we use in terms of what sort of technologies we're going to be using to obviously ensure that there is justice for the consumer, for law firms, for financial services firms, that sort of thing, so that we can conglomerate all the data together across borders and have one large ecosystem. So they're the kind of issues and challenges that we're facing, but we should be able to resolve that quite quickly by obviously communication, talking to various people around the world. We've obviously been, in various different other jurisdictions, and obviously talking together to see how we can resolve these sorts of issues, but obviously respecting other jurisdictions such as common law, civil law, various other Sharia law, those sorts of things around the world, and how we can obviously develop those AI models on top of the blockchain to obviously automate industries. So it's quite exciting, but yeah.
Yeah, and would I be right, Anthony, if I say the fact that you're combining both the AI technology as well as blockchain means that you're able to a certain extent, help to counter the challenges around ethical AI. You know, the fact that you have a view of the data at any given time. You know, you've got one giving you transparency, one with kind of hidden algorithms. Presumably there's some value you can create for customers there.
Yes, it's definitely creating value, and it's also bringing justice to the consumer. Eventually, once we've conglomerated all that data from the various sources, such as Experian or places like that, in terms of consumer data, obviously integrating privacy rights, we will then be able to bring justice to the consumer, where they would essentially be able to go onto an app or something like that on their phone or something and be able to gain access to justice very, very quickly, because it will obviously integrate blockchain into that. But that's essentially where the space is going, and that's why we're obviously automating various industries such as the financial sector, the legal sector, to obviously gather that data to then have to give access to the consumer. So it's much more easier for them to gain access to these justice, and then obviously the sort of ecosystem in regards to the sort of ethical standpoint in regards to that. So, but we obviously have to take into account that we have to ensure that we are being transparent in regards to the various jurisdictions, because we have to respect those different laws and frameworks that obviously exist within different parts of the world. So that's a challenge that I face and we face in general.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anthony. Yeah. So I wanted to dig into a couple of questions we have a question here from Hisham, and there's another one from John. Before we jump into our own kind of quick fire questions, I think we want to touch on, get some perspectives from your respective industries. So the question here from Hisham, in a world that is heading towards smart cities, larger social platform data collection and mass surveillance, how do you envision using blockchain ID management to protect the privacy of the citizens, yet be able to trace and stop bad actors from committing cyber crimes? Wonderful question. I think it touches on smart cities as well as Anthony's space of justice, right? So, Boran, did you want to take that?
I might let Anthony answer that one first. But I guess just in general, go ahead, and then I'll jump
in. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think, well, I guess for us, or how blockchain is used, is really about like having it's going to be a mix of like having the anonymity, but also knowing exactly like being able to like track all transactions, for example, being able to make sure, avoid fraud, and making sure that everything that happens in a city is linked to a specific like block on the blockchain is going to be essential to, I guess, protect the citizens and make sure they don't get like, they don't get, how do you say in English? They just don't fall into traps or like fraud. Yeah, compromise, exactly. And that their data is still protected through like, for example, anonymity. So in terms of like you see a lot of like cities like Singapore having now moved to like creating a digital identity for their citizens. And by being, or like Dubai as well, and being able to like create through this like kind of like token, it makes quality of life and like convenience for like citizens in terms of like access to service provided by like the government much easier. But that is not shared to like the rest of the world. It remains like public, it remains limited to the public sector, and that's how you manage to like protect their privacy from the public sphere.
Yeah. Thank you, Boran. Yeah, excellent points. Anthony, did you want to provide the law and order perspective? And also there's a follow-up question from John for you actually as well.
I think it's also about ensuring, it's about obviously what we do is obviously integrating threat intelligence, social media scanning, those sorts of things onto the systems, the ways in which governments also operate in regards to ensuring that there is threat intelligence. We obviously integrating threat intelligence into government organizations, such as in the United Kingdom, these sorts of things, to obviously ensure that our citizens are protected against any sorts of threats to their well-being and that sort of thing. So we have to obviously work with intelligence agencies, things like that, and also as well government agencies to ensure that there is these threat intelligence. Obviously having digital identities is very important as well, so that we can aggregate the data from that perspective. But yeah, it's just about ensuring that there is that element of threat intelligence. But it's a long sort of topic in terms of ransomware attacks, these sorts of things. But that's how we stop bad actors, is by working between the private sector who are developing these models, the threat intelligence, the social media scanning, the various algorithms that can protect our citizens from any threats that may arise in terms of crime and that sort of thing. And then once that happens, then obviously bringing justice onto the blockchain to obviously prevent and quantifying the quantum of outcome to a case. So it's very exciting. But yeah, that's the sort of thing that will be happening.
Yeah, and I suspect we're going to learn a lot from the cities or the jurisdictions that have already adopted kind of like mass identities, right? And Baran mentioned Singapore. I think there are a couple of other ones. I think there's a lot of innovation happening. In fact, a lot of it seems to Asia. I think Australia perhaps is looking at rolling out something. I could be wrong, but yeah, I don't know, Chara. Did you have some perspectives on what's happening in Singapore? Perhaps other jurisdictions where there's been lots of innovation in that space, KYC and identity management.
Yeah, I think that, it's definitely a big area sort of in Asia. It's definitely also very big for super apps. Like even if you're looking at ones that were transport or rideshare, they're getting into payments now. They're getting into food delivery, like lots of areas where you have to do those kinds of things, and fraud is something they have to deal with. There's a lot of fraud even on rideshare platforms when it comes to sort of drivers and those aspects in Asia too. So definitely the legalities are very big. So I would say that, yeah, there are a few things that are happening. I think one on the data privacy front, I think like Brian brought a really good example up. So one of the things that Singapore has done to tackle things like that, and that probably relates to the question before, is that that when COVID happened, a finite number of countries opened up very heavy contact tracing, and Singapore and Israel and a few of them were some of them. And the criticism or the debate that came up in other countries, including the US or the UK, and things were like, we can't do these things. That's just a breach of data privacy. It takes people's freedom. Like you say you're going to use it for COVID, but how do we know? And, the thing is, what Singapore developed is they went, okay, well, if that's your worry, they actually developed a token that you can go get for free at your community center. And that token wipes the data every 14 days. And if you don't feel it wipes it, you can wipe it yourself. And so you can decide not to ever have your contact tracing app on your mobile phone if you don't want to. So there's where I think there are ways for cities to actually tackle those things and have conversations about them, and also experiment with them and just say this is a strange time and we're trying. It might work, it might not work. Let's see how it goes. And citizens aren't always very tolerant of those things, but I think it's a two-way street. Like if you want your city to be able to do better, you have to be able to help them out with that and be open to it. And then, yeah, I think on the other side, I think Asia is, there's lots of interesting things that come up when it comes to KYC, right? An example is that generally, I think probably Baran could probably talk about this in Salima too, but I think healthcare has that similarity. It's like people are worried about sharing their data, but I think there's a literacy aspect as well. If you're not somebody that's a massive smartphone user, or you're not somebody who's about these kinds of things, when something appears and it asks for a selfie, you get freaked out. You don't know why a company wants this out of you. You don't know about those verification processes. So there's a lot of education, I think, that comes out of Asia. When even if you look at, I guess even at Gojek, when we were doing something that basic, people just stop at that stage and run off because they didn't understand why we would ask them to take a picture. Or even we'd have really interesting situations where people would wait a day till they looked all dolled up and then took a selfie because they were like, I don't know where this appears. I don't want this getting on the internet if I don't look good. So, there's a lot of aspects, I think, in when it comes to these where various levels of digital literacy actually pushes a lot more innovation from companies over here and governments over here, and a lot more education. And so in an interesting way, that leads to what we call a data transparency, right? The more you explain well to citizens, the more you have videos, or you reassure them, the more you invent these things where you're dumping their data or whatever else it is, the better actually you get towards the trust of data that we talk about.
Yep, keyword being trust, and of course blockchain helps there.
Yeah, I think just to add on that, another example is Estonia, because they've been using blockchain across, they've deployed it across its government for a lot of the healthcare registry, the property registry, the business registry. And in a way, you can only see how you can protect your citizens by actually just trying. And actually another main thing for like national and local governments is just going to be to like invest in their cyber security infrastructure, invest in the people who will be able to like manage infrastructure and make sure that it's like secure. And as you well, a lot of like governments, for example, are like would, or companies as well, would hire hackers just to test their security systems. And in a way that might be a good way to make sure that you are protecting the data of your citizens.
Thank you, Baran. Yeah, very good points all around. We have another question from John, which I'd like to put to Victor and to Tyler, because this is very much kind of product-centric type question, I guess, and it's a question that we certainly address when we're doing the market research for Netri Digital's product line. So it's from John Burns again, and he's asking here, okay, so we're talking about all these wonderful solutions and the potential for blockchain to solve some of these data-related challenges, right? But is all this creating an even greater digital divide for those not digitally native, right? And we're talking billions. What if you do not have the hardware, like the cell phone, right? Although I think many people around the world do, including third world countries these days. But what if, let's assume, right, if you don't have the hardware, a cell phone, will the applications being discussed have accessible user interfaces while ensuring personal data security and interoperability? How do you navigate those challenges? Maybe Victor, could you give some perspective of your, where you can, block apps, what kind of strategies you have in place?
Yeah, it's a big question, just largely around adoption itself, right? And I think one of the things is that managing, public-private keys, all of this is complex for a lot of people. It's difficult. So I do think, we are seeing the digital divide broadly. This is a technology, and people will need comfort with technology in order to utilize this solution. But, I spent 7 years in China, and I saw what happened in China where they leapfrog existing technology. Sometimes you have a problem where, you, for example, build on top of existing solutions, versus if you have completely clean infrastructure, you can adopt something very, very quickly and move forward with that even faster. So, for example, digital identities are rolling out faster in Estonia and India than in North America, and it's because they don't have that existing infrastructure that they have to move over. And I think that's an opportunity for many developing countries to explore. Obviously, and the sooner you can get that movement into these different areas, the quicker you can get citizens up to speed and bring them, even in some cases, leapfrog what exists in other developing countries in terms of technology understanding.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's less of a challenge in the third world of physical devices, because mobile phones have become, I think, a commodity, and the price point has dropped significantly across different markets. It's more the infrastructure to support them, right? So you need internet, you need electricity, perhaps those infrastructure or utilities is a bigger challenge than the actual devices. But then once there, it is going to be, I guess, as you say, kind of like driving adoption through these rich user interfaces and adapting, I guess, to the local market as well.
Yeah, and one of the things about that is that the need in those markets is higher. For example, I saw text-based payments in Africa well before, I still am waiting for it to come to Canada in some cases, a small amount. So there's a need to kind of adopt those solutions, and that needs, as the technology kind of lowers in price and gets more accessible, it drives that even quicker.
Absolutely, yeah. My origins from Nigeria, and I've got friends and family there who they talk about stuff and they say, "Don't you guys have that yet in the UK or Canada?" I'm like, "Oh, okay." What's he talking about? So you're absolutely right. Yeah. Tyler, do you have some perspectives in terms of tile-based and how you're addressing the user interface challenge and making sure you build something that's adaptable to different markets?
Definitely, we're adapting into different verticals and different markets. In terms of the point that Victor said, the accessibility, and the point that you made, Dennis, everyone has a cell phone these days in third world countries, like we just mentioned, and ultimately, you know, those could be individual modems, you know, to ping off of and have, you know, this decentralized internet as well, with the amount of power that is generated, right? So from a user interface perspective, you know, that's more so we're tapping into different verticals to allow for the onboarding of data and the sharing of data. But I just think, yeah, in terms of that question that was posed by John, there's definitely, you know, I see the divide, but it's not going to be for long.
Totally agree. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so for the sake of time, I think we're going to dive into some vertical specific questions. And if we can try and keep it within, say, 2-3 minutes at the tops, please. Okay, so for the first question here for Tara, what kind of UI UX strategies should organizations adopt to optimize the quality of data collected online? And I'm not sure if the question is kind of framed correctly, but hopefully you see where it's coming from, right? So when you're doing the designs and what kind of strategies you put in place, how do you ensure that that supports the capture of quality data, if indeed you can?
Sure. I think that, yeah, like I do think that, you know, you have to experiment a little bit and be kind of open to it. I think that also it's about using everyday kind of language. A lot of times I think what tends to happen is when we want to capture data, we're very technological in the way we say things. Like a perfect example being like, we still live in a world where, you know, we click on a site and it says 404 not found, which means completely nothing to, you know, someone in India or somebody in most places in the world, right? That tells the engineer what's going on, doesn't really answer why I didn't get my site up. So in the same kind of a way, I think it's about using, you know, the right language. I think it's also about, I do think, like, you know, sometimes it's important when you're collecting data to also, like, obviously the diversity sort of aspects of it as well, like, you know, how you wear things, who you're sending those policies to. You know, there's a tendency for technology companies to want to get to users very quickly. And if you get to users very quickly, you get to the smartphone users or have a bias of people who tend to be great at technology already, you know, making the effort to kind of make sure you're getting data off of the extremes or the diversity kind of an index. So you're building a platform that, you know, stretches. It has like a, you know, parameters and like a stretch to it. I think that's really important as well. And I also think that, you know, well, it sounds like maybe an odd thing to sort of say, but I think that a lot of times we tend to look for patterns in data. I think one of the biggest lessons I've probably learned working in a lot of markets like India or Indonesia or wherever else is actually breakdowns in patterns sometimes show you a lot more, because they show you where somebody is struggling with your product. We tend to love to pat ourselves on the back a little bit and feel good about our product. But looking at like breakdowns in patterns, looking at sort of where people, I guess, churn, obviously, is like a big thing. Yeah, I do think that's important. And parallels, actually. Like, I think a lot of times, probably a good example I can give is NPS scores. Like, you know, we all go around the world and we try and figure out like NPS scores. There's a lot of great surveys and reports that I encourage people to look at, where they actually go globally and they tell you how you need to adjust your NPS score. Because in Indonesia, for example, people will never ever give you like a positive +10. They're a median country. Whereas like in other places, they're very blunt and they'll skew it this way. You know, so understanding cultural aspects as well of your data, I think becomes really important. Otherwise, we tend to read data the wrong way.
Thank you, Tara. Yeah, it's a great point. And I think this emphasizes, I think I read somewhere that UI UX is becoming a science in itself. You know, it's interesting because back in the summertime, I was part of we organized a global hackathon. So it was like an inter-university hackathon. It was great to see the designs that students came up with. And when they were getting kind of career advice, that was one of the points we're emphasizing. Think about how you can apply your design skills to help analyze and understand local markets and how you can actually design solutions, the user interface to create new customer experiences for different industries, you know, so very exciting space. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that also that point you just made is that like what's beautiful design is something, you know, like we tend to think of Scandinavian design as beautiful, these gorgeous interfaces that come out, but you know, sometimes beautiful design is like really simplistic design that like scales across like 20 villages and might look like WordPress, you know. So I think like really keeping in mind those kinds of things, even building friction into a product is good because it means a user won't trip up, press something wrong and be upset at you. So I think that also, you know, like we sometimes think of, you know, perfection in design. And I think that, you know, when it comes to data and it comes to design, there's actually a lot about where things are breaking down in imperfection that teach us things too.
Yeah. Thank you, Charo. So there's a question for Victor, but there may be some other folks that want to contribute as well. Very important question here, Victor. So are there specific data-driven programs or policies organizations can take to help meet net zero targets? You know, so kind of like extending your point around sustainability, what kind of suggestions would you have for the organizations? There may not necessarily be regulatory clarity, but certainly we know that there are initiatives that they can put in place. How can they use blockchain, or how are you using blockchain to help them achieve those goals of net zero?
Yeah, I have 2 minutes to talk about that. That's usually
and I'm sure.
Sure, I do. Anyways,
Yeah.
I think, you know, to summarize briefly, it's like, you know, what you need to do is start collecting the data first. That's the first and foremost point that you have to start doing. And to Tara's point about UX, like what we've learned is, you know, in some cases, it's better just to start aggregating information from things you already have. Like you probably have systems that tell you, you know, temperature, or you have bills from your gas company, or these kind of things. Like once you start collecting that data, then you really kind of think about, okay, what can I do to provide greater transparency and provide value around providing that greater transparency? So, you know, you collect that data, but you also have to say like, okay, you have to aggregate and put that data someplace where other people can see it and validate that data. I, of course, would recommend putting it on blockchain, you know, and I readily admit my bias in that area, but like, you know, it's about being able to collect that data and also validate the source of it. So one thing I think we miss often in the conversation about aggregation is we only talk about control, but there is a loss in veracity of information because you don't know where the information is coming, right? With blockchains, you can store that, like, you know, when we build these projects, we say, okay, this piece of data is coming from an IoT device on this factory, or it's coming from an estimation that someone made in this department. And it allows you to kind of at least have that kind of better transparency to understand how these things are evolving over time. But the biggest thing I think I can tell anyone who's thinking about trying to get to a net zero target is really to start to think about, okay, what data do I have today and what am I missing? You know, and just going through that exercise and then think about once I have that data, where can I put it where other people can access it and they'll know it's reliable and know the source that it's coming from.
Wonderful. Thank you, Victor.
We've created a whole network called Trace Carbon to do that. I'm not going to go into details about that here, but you know, that we saw that need and we really kind of decided we were going to take steps to kind of provide value in that area too.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And just to, on that point, thank you, Victor, because you reminded me, just for the participants, just to let you know, we're going to share the contact details of the panel. And so if you want to reach out to them or your organizations, I'm sure they'll be able to address some questions, or if you have some questions about their products and services, they'll be glad to pass that on. Salima, I'll come to you in a minute because I do have a very important question on the healthcare side that I want to touch on. But there's a question from Rahul I wanted to bring to the table here. So the question is, the limitation in regulatory and legal landscape in the third world countries can at times be favorable in adopting to emerging trends technologies. Oh, actually, it's a point. It's actually an assertion, right? So it's not a question. Okay, cool. Yep, Rahul, totally agree with you. We cannot be myopic. We have to think kind of more broadly. It does vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that, Rahul. Salima, so I think this is going to be quite helpful for those in the healthcare space, but more broadly, other industries that are kind of like highly regulated, but also essential in many ways. So how can healthcare organizations navigate complex regulatory regimes while stimulating data-driven innovation? How do you actually balance the two, regulation, innovation, hey, you can't do stuff with that data, right? But how do you do it? How do you actually drive innovation? You're muted
Sorry.
now.
Yeah. So I think that's actually actually a really loaded question. I think it's still a really big challenge. You have different regulatory systems that are constantly changing. You, especially in the healthcare sector, and they're not uniform. So even in the Canadian context, they're different amongst the provinces. So in terms of the regulatory barriers of sharing, data for the purposes of innovation and research, it's a problem that's being solved for. And you see a lot of intermediary sort of platform companies coming into this space that are saying, okay, if you're a ma and pa shop clinic in, a small town, how are you going to invest in the sort of infrastructure that's needed to secure the data and so on and so forth? So there's a lot of these platform options that are coming in to actually make that seamless. So I think the players in that space are making huge strides, and I think that that's really been sort of moving really quickly. But I think that there's a lot of work that's also being done. And there's, sort of fora that are coming together with the government to kind of streamline a lot of these processes. So it's really about bringing the key stakeholders together to discuss how we're going to come around some of the regulatory barriers, because I find in a lot of the cases, the regulation is not even being able to keep up to speed with the actual reality of what's actually happening. And I've also seen some really good solutions that are coming now to kind of think about data. What's the biggest issue in healthcare data, right? It's really about the privacy and the personal information of the patient. So the de-identification of data, but also in terms of the data that is necessary for clinical research or real world evidence that's used for advanced research. We're now seeing other options, which is creating synthetic data sets, right? So it's almost creating an artificial simulated data set that is based on the actual real world data, but that now it's getting around this idea of having to share the information. So I think that's a huge step, looking for the workarounds where we're saying, okay, the real issue here with privacy and security is about personal information. So can we do solutions that actually solve for that so that we can still use the data for research? And so I think that's where we're headed in terms of trying to delineate, why this data can't be shared, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, and I suspect they're probably going to be looking to build on some of the innovations that we've seen in financial services, right? So you have PII data, personally identifiable information. You can extract that as per regulation, and you can use data in anonymized form as well, right? There are some certain use cases where, especially when it comes to testing algorithms and machine learning models, that's already been applied. But yeah, it'd be fascinating to see how this idea of simulating data gets applied in the real world of healthcare. Thanks, Lima. Right, okay, so I have another question here. Anthony, you've already talked about how blockchain and QC has been applied to deliver justice more efficiently. Can you elaborate a bit more on that? Because I think many of us may not be familiar with not just the technology, but the actual problem that you're solving, right? Is it a transparency? Is it more kind of helping the justice agencies to make sure that they're delivering justice in a way that makes sure that the DNA data samples are more accurate, or I could be off chain, but maybe just give us a bit more insights onto how the technologies have been applied, because I think it's a very exciting space.
So it's essentially about using quantum computing, integrating HFT, high frequency trading, all these various models into one algorithm to then come up with a sort of a quantum of proof, a evidential calculation of whether or not that evidence that's been collated is accurate according to the jurisdiction and the laws of that particular territory or those particular criminal or civil cases that arise. So, and obviously in other jurisdictions, so it's obviously coming up with an outcome to that and presenting that to the consumer, so that then there is a way of presenting that automation to the courts, to people who are, you know, who make those decisions. But it's about automating the legal industry and ensuring that that can happen. So
wonderful.
That's essentially what it's going to do, and obviously integrating the quantum power, you know, the automations within quantum computing. It just really automates things and makes things a lot faster and a lot quicker by integrating that into the legal community, into the financial services world. In those sorts of things, we can solve legal cases quicker, and by solving legal cases quicker and integrating that on top of blockchain, we then have the ability to ensure that justice is given to people, and that actually creates an issue where you actually not an issue, solves an issue where you have more automation around the world, more compliance, more once you solve more legal challenges, you have a much better, more ethical standpoint to come from. And that's essentially what the technology does, and that's what we sort of are developing, and what we sort of own, that sort of intellectual source code and that sort of thing in regards to that platform. So that's what essentially what we're going to be doing, and we're trying to obviously at the moment get that going into various law firms and public sector organizations, and obviously integrating cybersecurity at the moment and that sort of thing. But that's essentially how the vision of our company and the way that we strive to go forward. So yeah.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm sure you're going to have some follow-up questions on that. Much appreciated. Okay, so I'm going to give the last word, because I suspect we're going to get cut off in 1 minute. We'll see if there's a little time allowed. But Boran, if you wouldn't mind, perhaps, what guidance would you give to organizations who are implementing data management strategies for city planning, right? So just to kind of rephrase the question, what data management strategies should smart city planners implement to best serve global communities worldwide? Because I know your organization works across, you know, on a global level.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short, but I think the three main things that they should focus on is first interoperability. So making sure that we break down silos between like different city departments, but also between public and private sector, to make sure that the data can be used openly and transparently between different organizations. And not just at the local level, but also at the metropolitan level, because in our work, that's also one big problem that we see, is just that like local governments next to each other don't communicate, and that really like impedes a lot of like, well, the economic growth, but also net zero strategies and talent attraction, for example. The second thing is really to have to focus on collecting data that in a way that is like solution driven. So instead, one big problem, I guess, with like the open data or open data economy is just having too much data, as Victor mentioned, and you want to make sure that the data that you collect is really important, well, will help you to solve the problems that you're facing. And that's asking yourself the question, what is the best data that will help me solve this problem? Where can I get it? And that's how you create the relationships and interact with the stakeholders that you need. And you see, and it's also about like having up-to-date data and having real-time data that can help you inform your decisions. And the third thing is also sharing with other cities and other stakeholders, because kind of the whole aim of the panel was also for different people in different industries to like talk to each other about like open data. And that's the same thing that would happen, well, that cities need to do. Like everybody is trying it, everybody is like going at it from different perspectives, and sharing with each other and learning from best practices is the best way to progress and make sure that you can really improve and best serve the global communities that you're trying to serve.
Thank you, Boran. Very good points there. Again, I have a feeling you get some follow-up questions as well. So Salima, you might have seen the point from John here regarding synthetic data analysis. So clearly it's an area of great interest for our academic friends, UF team. And Rahul also makes a point regarding confidentiality and AI, which I think is important here. So thanks for those contributions. I do want to kind of come to Tyler, because I think it's interesting with all these different perspectives of data, the open data economy. Every single time the data is moved, it's stored, it's shared. One can only assume that it's incurring some kind of cost, right? So once again, it all kind of circles back to monetizing that data, because if I can't monetize that, if I don't understand the value of that data, then it's difficult for me to actually create a business model around it. So I guess the question is, what guidance or suggestions would you have for organizations who are thinking about monetizing their data, perhaps don't yet have the right frameworks in place? What kind of suggestions and ultimately solutions would you suggest from a tile-based standpoint?
For sure. I mean, one thing that we're focusing on is the collection of data, which is a huge pain point. Where is this data coming from? So we're working with different DAOs and creating our own decentralized autonomous organization that can put out. These enterprises could say, hey, we need data. We need a collection of data. Here's a job proposal that we put out to the community, and we need let's say healthcare in Salima's industry. We need medical imaging for clinical trials. They put out a job proposal, and they even could set up the funding for that job proposal, and then the community of data scientists would work together to aggregate and to onboard this data for the enterprises to use. Once that data collection is available through Tilebase, which is a decentralized marketplace in exchange for data and the access control of data, ultimately we're able to determine the value of that data through the buying and selling of the tokenization of the data. So I mean, we really will find the value of data and algorithms and APIs through this open marketplace, and this will help really determine additional revenue models for enterprises, as well as increase integration for new tech stacks and workflows ultimately, and then from that, there's going to be data that's generated from those machine learning models. So it's a perpetual cycle of monetization of data that's created and it can be done in this marketplace of Tilebase. So I'd love to talk about it more, and I would love to connect with anybody after the meeting to discuss the future of Tilebase and how we're looking to achieve that through our tokenization, our DAOs, and our liquidity pools around data, and how the community can get involved to participate.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tyler. And I think another point worth mentioning is also the insurance aspect as well. And I think that's certainly one of the things that attracted us at Netra Digital, because, with our solution, we're going to be collecting lots of information from different sources. And the idea is that once we actually collect that data and we run the machine learning models and do the data analytics, we want to make sure that we're getting a true sense of the value, taking into account that we need to secure that data and give a true sense of its worth to our end customers, So very good points. Thank you, Tyler. So it looks like it hasn't cut us off. I think we've got time to touch on a couple of other quick questions. So Victor, if you could perhaps give us some perspective on, because I know you guys do enterprise grade solutions, our block apps. How can institutions that process high transaction real-time data optimize business operations using blockchain? So I guess I'm thinking about things like banking, finance, perhaps insurance, but even supply chains and logistics. How are you actually handling massive amounts of data, given I know we used to have challenges with performance with blockchains, but I think a lot of those challenges have been addressed. So what kind of guidance can you give to organizations that are handling high transaction data sets to prepare for leveraging decentralized business models? Yeah,
so, well, two things. One is you got to get rid of proof of work, mining, that's hopeless in terms of speed. Most like enterprise blockchains including our own, use some variant of PBFT. So there's still a consensus agreement between the parties, so it's not centralized. You don't want to use a centralized thing, which some blockchain companies say they're blockchain companies, but they use a centralized order, which is no good. Then the second part is I really encourage people to think of things in terms of verification versus storage. So what I mean by that is that, to take some examples, real world examples, we have some projects that handle rights management and have large data sets But we generally keep those data sets off-chain, sometimes in cloud providers, sometimes in private chains, but then put a verifier on the blockchain itself. And in addition to that verifier, we include some metadata information about it so people know what that information is if they want to request it. So it kind of ties a little back to what Salima was talking about. Like, we've done some work in healthcare identity where, like, before someone can say, I'd like to buy that or I'd like to get value at, they need to have some idea of what's in there. So, maybe you have some valuable data. You've had COVID, but you wear a wearable and you have all that data that's available. You need some way of kind of providing that information on an anonymous basis. And we built like sort of identity solutions to kind of do that. And so, when you think about these large data sets, really what we start with is, you might have, we've done work with like IoT devices that report every 30th of a second, right? We don't try and put that entire data set on the blockchain. We try and aggregate it, every minute to publish information about what's in that data set on the blockchain and put that verifier along with a pointer to the full data set. And that's, the way I kind of think about how to kind of scale that kind of solution. But I will say, in the enterprise permissioned world, we're up to like thousands of transactions a second. It's not the same as in the public crypto world anymore, So we already have that advantage to begin with because we've removed mining.
Exactly, yeah, and I think this also speaks to the type of innovation happening outside of the cryptocurrency use cases, right, within blockchain. I think it's fascinating to think about the potential of applying this if you have the right, not just the right technology, but also the actual business, the underlying problem that you're solving. I think, which was your original question, right? We need to really think about how it's actually being applied in many ways. Okay, well, thank you. I think we're going to end it there because, of course, we're somewhat over time. Just want to say a quick thank you to all the participants, to our panel, of course, for sharing your time, including those in faraway time zones. Really, really appreciate it. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Tyler. We'll make sure that it gets to the panelists here. And we're also going to share the information as well. I know that there are many meetup members that couldn't join, and we'll be sure to make sure that they can reach out to you as well. Okay, so thank you. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.